Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Georgia from the Fashion for Good team, coming to you from London. I hope everyone is doing well. I'm pleased to welcome you to our second Fashion for Good Masterclass. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to get logged in. As a quick reminder, we've set this meeting up as a meeting rather than a webinar to make it as interactive as possible. So please do mute yourselves as you come in, otherwise we're going to have a little bit of background noise going on. So we'll just wait for everyone to connect, and thanks for bearing with us for a few minutes late in starting, but also good, gets everyone time to get on board. So I think we can kick off. I'm Georgia, again from the Fashion for Good team. Nice to meet you all. I think we have over, let me see how many participants, 150 participants with us today, representing many different areas, both inside and outside of the industry. It's great to have such a range of perspectives and insights with us. Great to have you here for our second masterclass, and welcome back to those who joined the first one, and hello to those who are joining for the first time. We designed these sessions to be useful whether you can attend 1, 2 or 3, so no worries if it is your first time. As a quick recap, our first session focused on innovation in the luxury segment. We heard from the perspective of Kering and 2 innovators they work with, Worn Again and Oratane, who are both part of the Fashion for Good alumni ecosystem. They spoke about the time it takes to introduce a new innovation into a company and the challenges they come across. We really were amazed by your participation and the great questions, so keep up the good work in this session as well. We also met a few of you during the breakout session and on the Slack channel afterwards. There were over 22 different nationalities, and yeah, some great knowledge that came through, and you were also eager to meet each other. So excited for this session to also continue. And the first homework question was around what expertise can you help others in your community with? And we had people from design, some people from consulting, people who were working in manufacturing, as well as some students studying. So really great to see such a range of people coming together. These sessions are an opportunity for us to dive, just a quick reminder, if you enter, can you just mute yourself, just so there's no background noise, thank you. These sessions are an opportunity for us to dive deeper into the innovation process and what is really required to scale sustainable innovations across the fashion supply chain. Usually we would host these sessions in person at our HQ in Amsterdam. And what we would normally do is take a bit of a pulse of who's in the room. So a poll should pop up now if there's no technical difficulties. Yeah, just to see who's here with us today. Okay, I think there might be a technical difficulty today. No worries. If you can drop into the chat, what's your background, whether you're a student, if you're dialing in as a brand, whether you're coming from a manufacturer, innovator, or a multi-stakeholder, a consultant or press, or just a passionate individual about this topic. Yeah, drop them in the chat, and also where you're calling in from today. So next slide, please. Oh, hang on a second, we'll just wait. Yeah, cool. So I'll start off with a quick introduction on the Fashion for Good's innovation platform, followed by a session by menswear brand ASKET, who will share learnings on integrating innovation within the supply chain from a brand's perspective. ASKET were featured in our Good Shop last year, so we've been fans of theirs for a while. So I'd like to welcome Sarah, Head of Communications at ASKET. Thanks for joining us today, Sarah. After Sarah has presented, we will then have a breakout session. We had some great feedback from the first masterclass that everyone really enjoyed this opportunity to meet like-minded individuals across the world. And that actually people would rather have it earlier in the masterclass. So taking all of that feedback on board, the breakout will actually happen after the first presentation. You can use this time to share insights and stories with each other. That's really one benefit of taking things digital. We can have people from all over the world joining us here today. This breakout is followed with a session from Unspun. Unspun are an on-demand fashion technology startup based in San Francisco and Hong Kong. Unspun were in batch 6 of our accelerator program and are now actually featured in our Good Shop. So if you are in the Amsterdam area or could be in the Amsterdam area, you can visit our museum get your measurements scanned, and see all the fabrics up close, and order yourself a pair of customized on-demand jeans. This is a really cool opportunity to get to feel all of the different fabrics in person before making your choice. If you can't visit us in Amsterdam, we are also really excited that we have launched virtual museum tours. And so you can visit our museum wherever you are in the world. To book tickets, you can head to fashionforgood.com/tickets. Oh, if you are unmuted, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. So Unspun will share learnings on integrating innovation within the supply chain from an innovator perspective. And I'm really pleased to welcome Walden with us today, all the way from Hong Kong, who is co-founder and chief hustler of Unspun. Hi, Walden, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll close with a panel discussion around the critical steps to adapt and scale innovations within the supply chain. So next slide, please. If we move on, Georgina, yes, thank you, my glamorous assistant. So how is this going to work? Let's touch on some of the tools available for those who are attending Masterclass for the next time. Over the course of our 3 Masterclass classes, we ask that you engage in the Slack channel. New participants should have received a link with an invitation to join prior to the start of today's session. On the Slack channel, you can find helpful resources and a starter list of channels. Please feel free to make this your own. If you have any issues with access, you can email us at connect@fashionforgood.com, and we'll also share all of this via the chat. There will be a few homework assignments between each class. Don't worry, we'll recap what you need to do at the end of this session. As a reminder, this is the second in a series of 3 masterclasses. The video of the first masterclass is available in the Slack channel, and details on how to sign up to the last one will be covered at the end of today's session. Before I get started, I wanted to give you a quick background on Fashion for Good. Some of you, I'm sure this is very familiar, and for some of you, this will be new. So, Fashion for Good is a global initiative that was set up to connect innovators and industry to drive commercial adoption of sustainable solutions at each stage of the value chain. Over the past 3 years, we've scouted over 2,000 startups from around the world, supporting over 110 of them via our accelerator and scaling programs. We're really focused on enabling strategic opportunities with our 19 corporate partners to drive these solutions at scale. So without further ado, I would love to hand over to our first speaker of the day, Sarah Arts. Next, please. Georgina. Sarah Arts is joining us from Sweden. She is head of communications at ASKET, who we've had the pleasure to feature in our Good Shop at Fashion for Good. And she will give you a behind-the-scenes peek on what challenges are faced when adopting innovations within existing supply chain. Thanks, Sarah, for joining us. And a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over. Please put any questions you have for Sarah in the chat. We'll have 5 minutes after her pitch to address them. Sarah, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, Georgia. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone today, and awesome to see so many people tuning in from all over the world. So as Georgia mentioned, I am the head of communications here at ASKET. I joined in March 2019, and as head of communications, my job is essentially to share the stories of all of the great things that are happening here behind the scenes at ASKET. And increasingly so also doing a lot of lobbying towards the fashion industry in terms of how we can operate in a better way. And as Georgia mentioned today, I'll be taking you through ASKET's story and the ways that we work, and then look forward to answering some questions at the end. So if I could have the next slide. And once more, there we go, thank you. So I think a good place to begin is at the sort of the start of the ASKET journey. And our co-founders, August Bringéus and Jakob Dworsky, were actually studying economics at Stockholm School of Economics. So didn't come from a fashion background. But what they started to do was look at industries that could sort of were ripe for change, industries that hadn't developed for a very long time. And so they started looking a little bit closer at their wardrobes. And what they realized is what they found in what they wore the most in their wardrobes is the image you see here on the left. So it's Steve McQueen in a classic white t-shirt, chinos. These are the garments that we come back to year after year, season after season, and that we feel good in. Yet when they then went to the high street, they were finding something very, very different. Sort of just stores filled to the rafters with different products, colors changing every season, pockets appearing, disappearing, distressed jeans, moving very, very far away from actually what we appreciate the most. So if I could have the next slide. And what that really stems from, the problem that the fashion industry faces is that despite being very clear what it is that what the garments are that we appreciate the most, the reality is that the fashion industry has got stuck in this cycle of producing ever more goods, filling shops faster and faster and faster, moving from not just four seasons a year, but actually introducing new collections every 52 weeks of the year. So sort of in order to turn a profit, fashion had got stuck in this seasonal cycle. So if I could have the next slide. Of course, as a consequence of starting to move so quickly, what they found was that the garments that were available were always compromised in some way or another. It was either in terms of quality, after a few washes, that already the seams would start to fray, the garment would lose its shape, and you stopped enjoying wearing it even after just a few cycles in the machine. There's also often a compromise in terms of fit. I think particularly when we look at our co-founder, Jakob, he's very tall and slim, so he's always having to find himself between a medium and a large, with the medium always coming up a little bit short and the large being far too big and baggy, but allowing for the length. And then there was also always a frustration with pricing as well, often particularly with branded pieces. You're paying a lot of money more for the logo than for the actual garment. And of course, at the other end of the spectrum, there are very affordable items out there, but almost too good to be true. So they set out to change that, and let's see how they propose to do that in the next slide. So their solution was to actually step out of this seasonal cycle, and rather than chasing the next trend, chasing the next collection, they instead decided to look back in time, identify those garments that are worn year after year after year, and introduce one garment at a time, building towards one permanent collection. The beauty of that is that you can focus a lot more on the quality in terms of design, finding the right materials, working with the right suppliers. They then also decided to introduce it in 15 sizes rather than the traditional 5, which covers sort of extra small to extra large. They introduced 3 additional lengths. So the t-shirt is available from the extra large to the extra small in a regular, short and long. Because let's face it, the world's 3.5 billion men aren't going to fit into just 5 sizes. And then finally, to really address the pricing issue, the guys decided to launch online only and go to direct to consumer. It cuts out an awful lot of middlemen and negotiations, and that sort of saving in price is able to go back to the customer. And not only were they direct to consumer, they were also very transparent about their pricing, so that consumers could see exactly what goes into making a garment, from how much the fabric costs, the production and the shipping. But that's not the only thing they were transparent about. If we go on to the next slide. Of course, when you launch a digital brand it can be very difficult to manifest that quality and fit online. So they decided to make our entire supply chain very transparent. And that was really to show, explain the quality that can't be manifested in person. but also really to focus on educating people about what truly goes into creating a garment. The theory is once you have a better understanding of what goes into making something, that you will respect it more and keep it for the longer term. And we continue to develop on that idea of transparency. If I could get you to switch to the next slide. So in 2018, to continue developing on that level of transparency, we actually set ourselves a standard called the full traceability standard. And what we realized is the beauty of having a permanent collection also, of course, means that you have a permanent supply chain. So where seasonal brands are often chasing the next collection and switching their supply chains with it, with a permanent collection, we're able to build up long-term relationships with our suppliers and actually drill down into the supply chain and uncover every aspect of that supply chain, from the raw materials to every single part of the production process and where it is cut and sewn. We make that available on our website, and we also sew it into a physical label into every single garment. You can see that here on the right-hand side of the screen. It is, of course, nice to see for the customer and increase their appreciation, but above anything, it holds us accountable for our practices. By aiming for 100% traceability, we're also saying that we are taking responsibility and accountability for what happens in our supply chain. And I'm very excited to share that to date, we have managed to uncover 81% of our entire collection, with a number of garments already at 100%. And the way that when we introduced this, we already had a number of garments in the collection, so we started to sort of drill down from the finished garment to the raw material, which can be very difficult. With every door you open, you find there's middlemen and more middlemen and suppliers within suppliers. So now when we introduce anything new, we actually start from the raw material and trace it up. And as a result, any new garment that we introduce into our collection now will actually have a minimum traceability score of 90%. So we're making great strides for the industry in terms of traceability. So, of course, this is a really great start, and the guys straight out of university were very excited to be in a position to challenge the current practices within the within the fashion industry, not just the supply chain, the fashion industry as a whole. But at the same time, being new to the apparel industry, they also learned a lot themselves. And let's go on to the next slide to sort of take a look at what they were finding. So something as simple as a plain white t-shirt can actually take 2,700 litres of water to produce. That's from the raw material that is grown in the ground to the production process of creating that fabric. It also produces 2.5 kilograms of CO2. And any white t-shirt, whether you buy it from Yves Saint Laurent or your high street store, will actually have 2 hours of manual labor going into that. It's a very specialized craft. And then if we click onto the next slide, what we also found was that it's not unusual to find something with so much resource and dedicated hand labor going into it available for €4. And they realized that something just wasn't adding up there. How is it possible that something of such value could be available so cheap? So we're going to look into that a little bit more closely together now. If you can click onto the next slide. I'm going to ask you a few questions through a poll. We're really going to look at consumer behaviors within the apparel industry. So here we have the first question. How many garments do you think are produced every single year? It's a multiple choice, so click on the answer you know or think is most reasonable. Bearing in mind that we have about 6 billion people in the world. So the most popular answer there is 8 billion. The true answer is it's actually 100 billion pieces every single year, which is quite astounding given that we already have so much. Then on to the next question. So of those 100 billion, we just gave you a sneak peek of the answers. Those of you who are paying attention, we should see the results improving. So the next question was, given that we produce 100 billion garments every year, how many of those are thrown away within the first 12 months of use? Again, multiple choice. Press the answer that you think is most likely to be correct. Wow, okay, so it looks like not many of you have faith in people keeping hold of their garments a lot longer and have selected 70% as the most popular answer. The truth is actually 60%, which is still quite horrifying, again, if you consider how much goes into making those garments. And then on to the next question. The next question is, so we have sort of ascertained that we get through an obscene amount of clothes over the course of the year, but let's think back to how people used to consume. So the next question is, how much has clothing consumption gone up in the last 15 years? So you can think about yourself, or you can potentially compare your consumption habits, say with that of your parents, or someone a little bit older than you in the family. And the results, again, 70%, it's actually 60%, again, very high, and indicates how consumer behavior has changed over the last 15 years, largely driven by this trend-led fashion industry. And then the final question on this slide, how much less are we wearing the clothes than we did 15 years ago? I'll give you a couple more seconds to fill in your answers. And the results. Exactly, everyone, the majority of the group got it right. It's 50% less. So I think we've driven the point home that the trend we're seeing in the apparel industry is that it's getting faster and faster. And not only is it getting faster, but we're keeping those clothes for less long. And if we can move to the next slide. And one more slide. The moral of the story is that in a bid to make more money, the fashion industry has actually undervalued its own craft, and that the fashion industry apparel has lost its value, and people are starting to see a t-shirt as something disposable when it's something that they can keep hold of for years and years and years. But that, of course, put us as a startup working in the apparel industry in a difficult position. The reality is we don't need any more clothing companies. We can click onto the next slide. But what we did realize is that we need to slow down, make less and better clothing that people value and wear for longer. And so what started out as a mission to make the ultimate sort of men's basic wardrobe has changed into something much bigger than that for us. If we can click onto the next slide. So what we realized is we can actually use our, what we call zero compromise garments as a vehicle for change. If you design something with quality, longevity, a good fit, and at a fair price to the consumer, but also a fair price that redistributes the money back into the value chain, that actually the industry can produce less and consumers can enjoy less. And our role in that is ideally to end the era of fast consumption, not only within the apparel industry, but as a mindset across industries. If we can click onto the next slide. Oh, I think there's there we go. Sorry for the delay there. And of course, for us, challenging the industry doesn't just come down to challenging the seasonal business model. We see ourselves as having a holistic responsibility across the entire value chain. So everything we do is considered, from the design to the materials we use, how we prototype, how we produce and with which suppliers, how we market our garments and how we distribute them. And increasingly, we're also starting to look at operating more circularly. So once a garment has left our warehouse and is in the hand of consumer, we don't see that as the end of our responsibility. We see it as our responsibility to also encourage people to maintain, reuse, refurbish, and then for us to take ownership of any recycling if it gets to that stage. The idea is to avoid that altogether. And all of our commitments across of these areas can be found on our principles document. I will share a link for this in the Slack channel later so that you can all take a closer look. If I could now have a look at the next slide. Of course, all of this sounds very wonderful in theory, but having been 5 years in now, we're actually starting to be able to put some real reasonable numbers behind our practices and understand how we can change the industry. So since launching with a t-shirt in 2015, we now have 32 items in the permanent collection, none of which have been removed. We have, of course, added some additional colors for those garments that prove very popular. And because the garments are permanent in our collection and we sell online, we have a direct relationship with our consumer. And before any restock, we ask for customer feedback and we refine that design. So much like software, our garments are only getting better with every iteration. We then also started asking our customers how often they use the ASKET t-shirt. And what we found is that the average ASKET wearer will wear their t-shirt for 180 times. If you compare that with other studies in Sweden, which says the average t-shirt is worn 30 times, that really shows how designing for longevity does have an impact. If you then look further down the line and compare that to how your impact reduces over time, of course, for us to produce our t-shirt, even though we produce mindfully, the reality is it takes about 2 to 2.5 kilograms of carbon to produce a t-shirt. I think we all need to be aware that every purchasing decision we make does take natural resources from the planet. But of course, if you wear it 10 times more than you normally would, you reduce that relative impact over time. So we're very confident with these numbers that designing for longevity and with quality in mind does ultimately make a better impact on the environment. And then if we look to the final slide now. We're very firm in the belief that actually if more brands were to adopt our business model, stepping out of seasonal cycles, designing for longevity and redistributing the cost throughout the supply chain, then actually the size of the fashion pie could be just the same in terms of value, but at a fraction of the volume. And if we look at the environmental impact of the fashion industry on the planet, that is really what is needed. There are a lot of initiatives out there that are a positive driving force, but the reality is the rate at which our consumption levels and production levels continue to grow, any of the environmental initiatives aren't actually making a dent. So we need to combine the two. We need to have better practices, but we also need to drastically reduce our consumption and production levels, and that doesn't need to be done at a consequence of the value of the industry. So that's it from me. I feel like that was a whirlwind tour from where we started in the initial sentiment to where we're going, how we continue to evolve, and also a nice best practice case study. And I believe we will answer some questions from the crowd now.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And I think what I always love about ASKET is when you go on the website and you scroll down, you can so clearly see all the information about the garment. So if people haven't had a little nosy around the website, I highly recommend you do, because it's amazing how easily it's laid out and how transparent the information is. So a question, do you continue to audit your supply chains on a regular basis, or how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, the beauty of having a permanent collection is that you do work with the same suppliers time and time again. Of course, just visiting them once isn't enough. And we have to play a careful balance, of course, with flying to all of these locations. But our head of product is incredibly close to the supply chain. And before any final production runs, she will go and visit and just make sure that the conditions of the facilities are as we've been told. We do use a number of other tools as well. We're currently using TrustTrace, which we use as a fantastic crowdsourcing platform. So when we go and visit facilities, we actually write a report and our findings in TrustTrace, which other brands can then use a reference. And of course, if other brands visit those facilities, we can check in on there as well. So even if we haven't been in a period of 12 months, we can check in just to see what the latest status is on TrustTrace.
And then I think we have time for one more question, and then actually we can pick up some of these in the Slack channel. Yeah. Do you take in the environmental intangible costs into effect in your costing? How does the costing work?
That's very interesting. And I mean, I think that's part of the problem with the industry, that environmental impact doesn't have a monetary cost put on it. And I think if companies were to be taxed on their environmental impact, you wouldn't be allowed to launch a t-shirt for €4 because that means there have been shortcuts made in the supply chain. It's not something we currently do, but we are in the midst of completing our life cycle assessment. So having traced our entire supply chain, we're now able to go in and work specifically with our suppliers to better understand the impact they have. And we will communicate the carbon impact, the water usage, as well as the energy use at every single stage of our garments production process. And we're working out now how we will hold ourselves accountable for that impact as well. I think the first stage is getting that information, sharing it, and then figuring out what to do with what we've uncovered.
Thank you. Really interesting, and some other good questions that I think we can hopefully cover, I can't speak today, cover in the panel session later. So thanks, Sarah, for your time. So next up is the breakout session. This will give you all a chance to connect with some of the others on the call from around the world. So everyone should be automatically split into groups, hopefully no more than 3 to 4 people. And you will have a total of 7 minutes to quickly introduce yourself and to tackle or touch on the question, what do you think is most challenging about driving change in the fashion industry? If you feel comfortable, please do turn on your camera, give a quick intro about yourself, and feel free to share your LinkedIn profiles or contact details if you want to, so you can continue to connect after the class. If you feel like this question is a bit daunting, you can also use the breakout to chat about what you do and why you signed up today. So it's
I can't hear it.
Can't hear it, right? Okay.
It says it's not muted, but it clearly is.
Right.
So what's going on? Why can't I hear it?
I don't know.
I didn't know there would be breakout sessions.
Hi, everyone. Nice to have you all back. I hope you all enjoyed talking with everyone. I don't know if the Fashion for Good HQ could put the presentation back up for me. We'll give them a second. I hope you all found the discussions fruitful and always an opportunity to connect with the people you were talking with in the Slack group afterwards. My group were talking about the need for greater traceability throughout supply chains and how that can be challenging if you're a smaller brand, or also about like how you can improve inventory optimization and how that actually makes sense from a business perspective as well as a sustainability perspective. So hope some other interesting insights were shared. Next, please. So next, joining us is Walden, who is co-founder and chief hustler, which I love, at Unspun. As I mentioned at the start, Unspun is an on-demand fashion technology startup based in San Francisco and Hong Kong. And Walden's going to dive into some of Unspun's experience working with brands and consumers. So I hand over to you, Walden, and appreciate you joining us at what I think is quite late time in Hong Kong. So thank you.
Thank you. It's just 10:47. It's fine. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so like Georgia mentioned, my name is Walden. We're from Unspun, and we at Unspun create an on-demand supply chain. Our first product to the market is denim jeans. If there's a question around why denim jeans, I can answer that. Afterwards, there are very good reasons. There are a few really, really bad reasons. But can I have the next slide, please? When we talk about Unspun internally, we say we are actually quite inspired by waste, and in a way, if you look at the fashion industry, and Sarah alluded to this earlier, it's actually very hard to predict ahead of time what consumers want, despite best intentions and best efforts, especially when the supply chain and design cycles are 6, 12, at times 18 months long. And so what ends up happening in our observation, having worked a little bit within the industry, is that as much as 20% of the garments that are produced can can end up in a landfill, never worn, never sold. And so our thought is that if we could create the technologies that enable an on-demand supply chain, then we can contribute to solving this issue. And how we measure our impact and our North Star as a company is if we could reduce carbon footprint, global human carbon footprint by 1%, that'd be a really meaningful contribution. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, back up. Back up one slide. Yes. And so talking about excess stock, here's the first quiz question, if we can bring up the quiz. So the question is, how many months of inventory do you think fashion brands typically hold? So the half of you basically say that the brands typically hold between 3 to 9 months of inventory. Pretty close. So next slide, please. Right. So we actually took a look at publicly information. So these are financial information that 50 of the largest brand apparel retailers have to disclose on a quarterly basis, and just looking at the impact of COVID-19 as well. So essentially in Q2 of 2020 compared with last year, same period, across the board, fashion companies are taking about a 30% hit in terms of revenue. They're selling 30% less. And what's even more staggering actually is the number of months of inventory that they're holding. Historically, companies that are publicly listed, the top 50 companies that we're looking at, they're generally holding around 4 months worth of inventory. Luxury goods, slightly different, longer inventory months. But looking, sorry, not yet. But looking at Q2 2020, so where the orange bars are where basically we just passed that quarter where the COVID hits us the hardest. Brands are actually now holding anywhere from 6 to as many as 17 months of inventory. This is only really the first layer, because consumers are still purchasing, and when consumers are purchasing, typically they're purchasing online. And when they purchase online, what we do know is that returns rate are generally high, because there is an expected behavior for free returns, and consumers, because of unsure what they would want or the sizing differences, they might purchase a couple of sizes and expect to return some of them. And so we know for a fact that online e-commerce fashion returns is higher versus when you do that in store. And so if you couple that with the fact that the fashion industry or the supply chain is really not engineered and designed to deal with return goods, and actually it's more economical to throw away the return goods, we're sitting on actually a looming issue with rising levels of inventory. People buying online and return goods are not, properly treated in the system. So inventory is definitely something that we have to solve for within this industry. Next slide, please. So what we do is twofold. We have essentially a 3D digital fit system where we have customers go through a 3D body scan. We create custom jeans on demand. And so at least from this perspective, we are helping to contribute to a zero inventory model where no stock, no goods are being shipped to landfill. So operating a zero inventory model. And we are on the back end, we're also creating a 3D weaving machine where yarns that go into everyday product are 3-dimensionally woven into the pant legs. And so when this goes live, we can essentially go as close to a zero waste process as possible versus the current paradigm of having to cut. Existing industry, best practices is from the cut and sew process, you generate about 10 to 15% of fabric waste. So we think if we could combine the technologies, then we could be reducing waste and get to as much of a zero waste process as possible. Next slide, please. But today, it's not really about unspun. We're trying to use unspun as a vehicle to hope to share some of the lessons that we have gone through and hopefully provide some bit of inspirations. So this is another quiz poll question. Along the supply chain, obviously this is not an exhaustive list, but just to simplify, along the supply chain, who do you think has the biggest power to affect change? Consumers, 52%. Majority consumers and brands, 22%. Cool. Not a lot talking about innovators, 4%. And obviously government and regulators. Cool. This is obviously an open-ended question. Next slide. But as an operator or an innovator within this fashion industry along the supply chain, we still operate within this landscape. And how might we be thinking about who to influence to affect change? And we thought a lot about like the process of innovation. And one of the lessons that we learned is this bowling pin analogy, where you think a lot about the beachhead market. What first stakeholder do you influence that could have a knock-on effect to the rest of the industry? And so when we take that frame, we thought collectively consumers still, like you guys showed in the poll, consumers collectively has the biggest collective power. And we thought if we could influence a portion or segment of the consumer base, then maybe we stand a chance of influencing brands who are really good at storytelling, and they could be influencing the factories and the mills and the spinners to be effecting a systematic change, because the unspun model is pretty ambitious, it's pretty bold. If we were to realize that we have to have a lot of the stakeholders to coordinate. So that was our thesis going in. Next slide, please. As they say, the world is changed by your example, not your opinion. So when we started in 2017, 3 months into our journey in entrepreneurship, we thought, okay, we're going to start with the consumers. And so what we did was we rented a space, 100 square feet space, and we then we rented a body scanner, and we invited friends and strangers, and just wanting to see and validate if the end consumers, we're solving a real pain point for them. And so we had them go through the 3D body scanning experience. We told them you can customize your jeans, and it's gonna, fit to your body. And are you willing to pay for this? And we were slightly blown away by the feedback. We heard from them that a lot of them actually have given up on jeans because it's really hard to find jeans. And the fact that 3D body scan could provide a way for them to find custom clothing seems to be a possible solution. And they trust in our ability to deliver, which lead to a second problem. Next slide, please. And this is the problem of manufacturing. So prior to opening the pop-up, we did a few samples, and we thought, okay, we could do this. But we had dozens of orders. I think we had over 50 orders in the 2-day pop-up that we had. And we're like, okay, we have never produced this magnitude of order. And so how can we do this? And manufacturers didn't want to talk to us because according to them, this is something that cannot be scaled. And so with that, we did a couple of things. One, we traced down one of the city's largest laser cutter, and we essentially just dominated that laser cutter and used that laser cutter to cut out the patterns that were generated from our algorithm to make it significantly easier to collaborate with us. And two, we sort of bought from some of the fabric mills the excess fabrics that they were producing for bigger brands anyway. And since the industry is somewhat always connected, we also asked the fabric mills, hey, do you have manufacturers that you work with that you think are flexible, and maybe one of them would be entrepreneurial enough to try this? And we went down the list of 40 manufacturers that they gave us. I think on our cold call to the 23rd one, we got a hit, and we produced our first batch of products from this process. Next slide, please. And so I talked a little bit of that process of like convincing consumers, and hopefully brands would sign on. And with the first pop-up under our belt, we thought, okay, now we're gonna up our game. And why would we get stuck in a physical location? Let's put everything on a truck. Let's put the scanner. Let's put the stack of jeans. Let's drive around the city and just get to as many consumers as possible. On top of that, we thought maybe because this is so novel, we could be inviting some brand representatives to try this on. And so we were bold enough to just cold email some of the brand representatives to track them down. And obviously we're operating as a startup mentality, move fast, break things, and we didn't check any sort of compliance issue. This is a cool concept on paper. In reality, it's highly illegal to be just doing this. And so when we launched this, we were just chased down by the police left, right, and center. And actually one of the brand representatives said yes to coming to our truck. But the moment we arrived at the appointment destination, we were just being chased by the police. So she actually had to walk 20 minutes to find the truck. The whole point about showing up where customers are just completely disproven. But she was kind enough to walk 20 minutes to find the truck. We convinced her to stay. We convinced her to do a scan. We made her a pair of jeans. We didn't hear back from her, probably because it's suboptimal. 6 months later, we got a call from her. She said, maybe I've got a brand for you. They're willing to try this, and that's how we started the first brand partnership. And so one of the lessons we always take away from this experience is obviously people work along the industry representing different companies, but everyone is first and foremost a human, and at the end of the day, a consumer. It's really hard to convince the decision maker within organizations without first convincing the consumer in that decision maker. So we always take that lesson to heart when we talk to brands. Next slide. Yep. And so with a bit of traction behind us, we opened our first store in San Francisco. And like everyone else, we were hit by COVID. Actually, we were lucky at one point. We were featured in the Time magazine, and people were driving to come to do a scan from, I think, as far as Nevada to California to try out this process. But like everyone else, we were hit by COVID, and we actually had to lay a few people off, the branding and marketing team, cutting all marketing initiatives. And we thought to ourselves, how could we revive this business? And so we put all of our resources behind thinking, how could we sort of relieve our reliance on the physical retail space? And that's when we accelerated the development of mobile scan. And now beyond the four walls of our store, we are able to sort of do the 3D body scanning from remote customers. And that's also the experience that we've set up for Fashion for Good. Next slide, please. Yes, and for the first 2 years in our business, we actually were using raw denim fabrics just because we couldn't find a way to sustainably wash the denim jeans. We visited over a dozen factories and would ask them, are there more sustainable ways to do this washed look? And there would be machines that are ozone, laser, that are known to have a lesser impact, no chemicals used. But they would be just sitting at the corner of the factories because according to the factories, no designers are willing to take up on this technology. And so we work with a manufacturer called Frontline, and we developed this custom-made, washed sustainably line with them. And yeah, 2 months ago, we launched this line that is sustainably washed. It's something that consumers really want. And now about a third of our volume is actually driven by this line. Next slide. I think we're coming to an end. And this is Homecoming. So as Georgia mentioned, we're part of the Fashion for Good Accelerator program. And a big part of the mandate is for us to do a partnership with bigger corporations. And during our time, our acceleration period is 3 months. And looking at our model of innovation, we thought it's close to impossible to really land a pilot project with one of the brands. So what we did was we looked around the room, and one of the companies in the same batch was Resort Sex. They create this stitching thread that fuses at 220 degrees Celsius. And for the longest period, we haven't thought about the circularity of jeans. And so we did a pilot with this startup and innovator using the stitching threads in the hopes that when we do collect the jeans at the end of life, of the custom jeans at the end of life, then we can repurpose the denim fabric so that we can keep the materials within the loop of fashion instead of having to downcycle. And so during the demo day, instead of pitching to the corporate, we actually launched this collaboration last year. And right now in our collection, all of the white threads are by default dissolvable, thanks to this collaboration. With that, I think that's all of the lessons and sharing that I could do. Feel free to ask me questions during the breakout session. Next slide. Also have all of my contact details, my email address. Yeah.
Thanks, Walden. Super interesting. And I think particularly to hear your insights about the conversations that you've had with brands and manufacturers, and a little bit more transparency on the reality of what's going on behind the scenes. Somebody asked, how do you deal with individual fit preferences and resulting returns? Is that a challenge?
Yeah, so right now we are at about 85% fit rate. So unlike a traditional tailor model where you go in for measurement, first fitting, second fitting, third fitting, what we do is 3D body scan, and then the expectation is that the first product that we deliver is something that people will want to keep. Right now, that percentage is 85%. What we do is we have now a large collection of photos of people from different sort of body types, and we'd be able to sort of showcase that to the customers during a virtual appointment process, so that they know what they're buying for people that have maybe a similar body types. On top of that, we also have this capability to visualize the garments on the avatar almost real time, so that we can make sure that whatever we're showing on the website and whenever we're communicating the differences across a skinny fit versus a tapered fit, it's close to the expectation of the end consumers. Yeah.
And then somebody asked around the fact that cotton's one of the most polluting industries and how you've dealt with that with denim. But I think you touched on that, talking about using specific materials from certain suppliers, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to add there.
Yeah, absolutely. So cotton is definitely something that's consumers would want. They want the feel and the property that comes with cotton. So, and we're not very good, admittedly, with cotton. So within our fabric selection, we default to either BCI cotton or recycled cotton or organic cotton. We never use any virgin cotton. But there are actually companies that are looking into cottonized hemp as an alternative. Levi's actually has a collection, has a small collection that they're going to launch with that. So yeah, I think alternatives would become available as bigger brands adopt these new technologies and materials.
Yeah, we're a big fan of cottonized hemp. We have Bear Fiber in our current batch who are using and developing materials in that space. So I think I'd like to invite Sarah back now, so to open up the panel discussion. So if Sarah would also like to unmute herself and switch on the video. So I've lots of questions coming through in the chat, but perhaps one to touch on. We have seen lots of press attention around supply chain transformation, that there will be an increase in nearshoring, onshoring, or on demand, but often it's tricky to find commercial technologies to back this up. What do you think needs to happen to push this forward, or what do you see as barriers in this space? If we start with Sarah.
Yeah, it's, I mean, the supply chain is an incredibly complex web, and it relies on components coming from various different parts. So the raw material will come from one country, say it's something like cotton, it's then cleaned in another country, it's then spun into a yarn into another country. And in order to drive change, you need to see change in every single one of these locations. And of course, that then becomes reliant on individual governments who have their own policies and regulations. So with that in mind, I guess what would be, it's not an easy solution, but what would be a solution is an organization that is able to have conversations across all levels of the supply chain in all countries. And potentially, I think, as Walden pointed out in his presentation, it can be consumers and brands that can have the biggest impact for change. So maybe it is that brands are held accountable for who they choose to work with in their supply chain, and that those individuals need to be part of some sort of consortium. If they're not part of that consortium, how do you then challenge that? It could be that it is through taxing the organization, grading the aspects of their supply chain on whether they are good or bad, and then incentivize that somehow to push the industry into using better suppliers and aspects across the supply chain.
And Walden, I don't know if anything else you'd like to add on that.
Yeah, if the question is specifically about nearshoring and onshoring and on demand, we have made a lot of mistakes and bumped into a lot of walked into a lot of walls with this. So it comes down to a tension where in a lot of the consumer markets where you're trying to set up a supply chain, the labor cost it's almost prohibitive to create an on-demand supply chain that's onshore. And so then you need to factor in automation. And so when you look into automation or sort of additive manufacturing space and the overlap between that and fashion, you find probably a handful, maybe 10, 15 companies that really are working on this. We're one of them, but we're super early, young. There is Sobo, software automation. And so the innovation that supports the automating of the supply chain is actually really, really narrow. It's really only a few companies that are working on that. And then beyond that, there is also a social component. So what we also had tried to do is to create an on-demand supply chain, not with a lot of automation in the United States, for example, but because factories have not been operating there for a while, the skill sets or the talent pool for even sewing is not that deep. So that's another sort of tension there. But what we have been seeing in this space is that because a lot of the governments are seeing the biggest financial crisis and they want to prop up their local economy and to sort of transition into higher value added jobs, we are seeing a lot of the governments actually push through local initiatives where they support industry 4.0, smart manufacturing assembly line. So we're seeing some financial resources going into, especially in continental Europe, where there is still some expertise and manufacturing. Yeah, and so I'm quite bullish here. It will take time, and we're already seeing some consortiums forming among brands, some manufacturers that have been operating in Southeast Asia, developing countries, setting up like factories with automation in more developed markets.
And I think anything else that you like to add of what you think a vision of what supply chains will look like post-COVID, or do you think covered mainly in what your vision of the future supply chain could look like? Sarah, maybe.
Oh, sorry. For me, I think the industry has been based on outsourcing. So in order to produce cheaper garments, it's about outsourcing it to factories, the factories that give them the best price. And as I mentioned in my presentation, because a lot of sort of once you start pushing down prices, you of course have to start making compromises somewhere. And that can be anything from not managing waste properly to pushing prices of those individuals that work in your supply chain. I think what I would like to see in the future is actually a much more vertical supply chain where companies start taking ownership of their supply chain again, and that the suppliers they work with aren't hidden behind the scenes. It's really a push for more accountability, regardless of sort of whether that supply chain is on demand or permanent or offshoring. It's about moving back towards vertical supply chains and accountability. Brands shouldn't be able to rely on outsourcing to pass the buck on practices that are happening for the clothes that they're selling in their stores.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, particularly when you're looking at like measuring carbon impact and taking responsibility for the impact from like a greenhouse gas perspective. And someone actually asked that when you did your Q&A, Sarah, whether ASKET were headed towards being carbon negative. I know from a UK perspective, there's a brewery that just announced they are carbon negative Brewdog now. And I wonder when we'll see the first fashion brands also coming out.
Yeah, I noticed that question earlier too, and I even made a note. Okay, so I don't want to undermine initiatives that are driving positive change, but I think we need to be really frank here. Carbon negativity doesn't exist. And it comes down to the fact to produce a t-shirt, it takes 2.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide. You can look to reduce that, but it's very, very difficult. And of course you can look to offset it. But really what you're doing is you're just putting a band-aid on the problem. And I think we need to be acutely aware of that. Yes, there are initiatives to remove carbon from the environment, planting trees, monetary support to positive initiatives. But the reality is, if you're going to produce something, it's going to use resources and it's going to have an impact. And that's something we can't move away from. So we will do our life cycle assessment. We will look at areas where we can decarbonize, reduce the impacts that we're having, but there will be a stage where you can't go any further. But that's not to say that we won't look at initiatives for how we can rebalance that, but we will definitely continue to be very clear about the fact that there is no such thing as carbon negativity. And I think once you realize that, you might actually consider your purchasing decisions a bit better rather than offsetting it or distracting it by a different initiative.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point on thinking about you really want to see transformation across the whole supply chain. So from raw materials through processing, manufacturing, all of these different aspects. And I think definitely sometimes it's about like tackling one and then looking to tackle the other. Obviously, ASKET are very focused on like the materials that they're using and traceability, and then Unspun are really working in how to produce a product that reduces the amount of waste that's being created. And I think both play a really valuable role in driving change in this area. Walden, another question that came up was why you'd chosen to work with a brand first rather than direct to consumer. But I actually had it written down that you'd done it the opposite way. So perhaps you could dive a little bit into some of the your work with brands and why you decided to go the direct to consumer route.
Right. Yeah. So I guess longer term, like I stated, the mission is to reduce 1% global carbon footprint. So if you do the math, even if we produce all the jeans in the world today, we're still multiples away from that goal. So if we are we're living true to that goal, then it just means we have to be an open platform. We need to be working with other companies, and you can only have so much impact being a small, I guess, denim brand affecting change. So I think one of the barriers why fashion industry hasn't moved as aggressively as other industries is that there is a little bit of zero-sum thinking or secrecy, almost, of trade secrets of players keeping to themselves. So that's something that we sort of want to work against as well. Directly to the question of working directly with consumers. As a startup, the one thing that we can rely on is growth and feedback. So essentially being able to iterate and fail fast and lift through the feedback cycle. And so we thought that the most beneficial way, the most direct way for us to benefit directly from a feedback, whether, when we're trying to sell $150, $200 pair of jeans, if it don't work, consumers are going to be screaming at you. And so those feedback are extremely valuable, especially when we started, to help us perfect what we offer as a combination of working in the physical world, working through the supply chain and the software. If we are just a software company trying to sell to brands, not having worked through the supply chain, it's going to be significantly harder for us to tell them that, hey, this works. Like, if it works for a brand with 5 people, you can for sure make it happen. So sort of leading by that example was for us quite powerful.
And then in terms of thinking about like what would be next for Unspun, obviously now you've made it with jeans. Have you got plans to expand your product line, or what could it be used for?
Within our direct-to-consumer brand, I think we'll stay relatively focused in the product categories, or at least the occasions. For other companies or partnering with other companies, bigger brands, we have begun conversations exploring product categories beyond jeans and bottoms, because returns don't apply only to jeans. So yeah, so for other companies, we are open to other product categories, but within our own brand, we want to stay focused.
And I think, Sarah, to go back to ASKET now, how do you think that you can continue to maintain transparency throughout the supply chain and build on that supply chain visibility that you've already done so much fantastic work on? What are some solutions you see in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think transparency and traceability are just the first steps of the process. And what it allows you to do is to understand what is happening within your supply chain and uncover what is going on. Of course, the next step is accountability and actually changing practices within that supply chain. So we're very much, I think we're a small team, we're a team of 11. And if you look at our traceability standard, without sort of sounding too big-headed, our traceability standard is probably one of the industry leading ones in terms of how much we uncover. Now that we've uncovered that, our next step in the process is that life cycle assessment. We're going to be able to get specific feedback on the impact that we are having as a brand. So if we notice that one of our suppliers has higher than average energy usage, we can look to understand why that is. Which energy sources are they using? Can we encourage them as a brand to shift towards renewable energy supplier rather than a fossil fuel energy supplier? So I think to sort of succinctly answer your question, traceability and transparency is one step towards accountability. And then once you know, you can then start driving for changes in practice. It's not just from a supply chain perspective. Often we sort of joke around in the office, maybe we can see who are our biggest consumers and we should tell them they've reached their quota for new clothes for the year. So sort of, you know, this idea of a fashion brand telling people to stop buying stuff from them.
Yeah, you can't check out.
Exactly.
I love it.
So, I mean, you know, we joke about that, but I do think it's a communication we will roll out in the future just so that people are a bit more considered. Do I need this t-shirt? I've already bought a white one 2 years ago, and we've already seen that they should be getting an average of 180 wears out of them.
I think all of these things also about like how you can educate people to look after their stuff for longer or in a more effective way. And I know that's also part of what we're doing through the museum, is teaching people how to repair their clothes. Or I know ASKET as well have top tips on how to like reduce like yellowing on t-shirts and things like that. So I think all of these different bits and pieces really help people to look after their stuff. So keeping an eye on the time, I think that concludes our panel for today. I've been keeping track of the unanswered questions and I'll pop them in the Slack so Sarah and Walden can hopefully answer them afterwards. I'd really like to say thank you to Sarah and Walden for taking the time out of their busy schedule to share their insights with us today, and for Walden for staying up till 11 o'clock. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I want to reiterate, please make sure you register for the Slack channel if you haven't already done so. You should have received a link in one of our emails, and we'll post it again here. Nicola's already done so, thank you. Send us an email at connect@fashionforgood.com if you get stuck, or post it in the chat. For the new participants today, what is this Slack channel? As we said, we'll share a lot of useful information in relation to the masterclasses in this space. There will also be a homework question that will be led in the channel for each of the series that you can get stuck into after the session. And we'll also share some interesting reads, and please share yours as well. I think everyone's so immersed in these topics, we're living and breathing it in our everyday lives. And so if you find something interesting, please do send it to everybody else. The questions are there to challenge your thinking. There isn't a right or a wrong answer, and we won't check your submissions, but do share your answers. I think the best way to learn is from each other. So our last question was around what expertise can you help others in this network with? And yeah, we covered loads of different backgrounds as I talked about at the start. This week's question is on what innovation you would like to implement. So what sustainable innovations can you find yourself? Pick 2 you think should be implemented and share why. The next masterclass, changing the future of fashion, sorry, no face in there, I was trying to do triple alliteration, is on the 24th of September, and we'll shift our focus on how to inspire, educate and foster the innovators of the future. So I don't want to keep you here any longer. So thank you once again, Walden and Sarah. Appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and we'll meet you in the Slack channel.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Speak soon.
Bye-bye.